Lena Bradford was halfway through her 12-hour shift when a teenage boy stumbled into the pediatric wing, pale as a ghost and gripping his stomach like it held a live grenade. Hey, deep breaths, Lena said, instantly moving to him. Tell me what's going on, sweetheart. The boy looked up at her with wide, panicked eyes. It's probably nothing. My dad said I was being dramatic. Let's find out for sure, okay? She said gently, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder and guiding him into an exam room. The clinic was packed, as usual, but Lena had a sixth sense for the ones who needed her most. He looked about 15. Tall and lanky, with tousled dark hair and a nervous energy that reminded Lena of her younger brother when he'd broken his arm and tried to hide it. I'm Lena, she said, easing him onto the paper-covered exam table. And you are, Caleb, he mumbled. I think it's my appendix. Well, let's see if we can rule that out. As she examined him, asking questions and keeping her tone calm and light, she noticed how his hands trembled. She handed him a cold water bottle and sat beside him. You're not alone, she said quietly. Even the strongest people get scared. You're doing great, Caleb. He looked at her like she'd just handed him the moon. Thanks. You don't talk like the other nurses. I don't like white walls and scary silence, she smiled. I like being human. She had no clue that someone else was watching. Just outside the partially open door, a man stood frozen, his sharp eyes locked on the nurse who had somehow calmed his son down in less than 5 minutes. Harrison Blake wasn't used to having his breath catch like this. At 6'3" and a billionaire CEO of a private tech firm, he'd faced boardrooms, lawsuits, and international negotiations without blinking. But the way this nurse was talking to his son, the way she actually listened, that rattled him. He knocked softly on the doorframe. Dad, Caleb said, his voice still shaky. This is Lena. Lena turned to meet the eyes of the man who stepped into the room. Her heart hiccuped. He had that kind of presence, dark suit, perfectly tailored, expensive watch peeking from beneath his cuff. His jaw was sharp, his hair slightly tousled like Caleb's, and his deep voice carried authority even when soft. Is he okay? Harrison asked, eyes flicking from his son to Lena. We're running a few things, but I don't think it's anything urgent, she said, standing. He was just scared. You're lucky he's got good instincts. We'll keep an eye on him. Thank you, Harrison said, his gaze lingering on her for a second longer than necessary. I appreciate what you did. All part of the job, Lena replied with a polite smile, trying not to think about how ridiculously attractive this man was, but Harrison didn't move. He looked at his son, then back at her. Still. Thank you. And then he walked out, leaving Lena with a strange feeling in her chest. Later that night, after Caleb was discharged with a clean bill of health and a prescription for rest and hydration, Lena stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The clinic's back lot was quiet, her breath fogging in the cool evening air. To her surprise, a sleek black car was parked near the curb. Not just any car, a Bentley. The passenger window rolled down. Off duty now? Harrison asked from the driver's seat, a trace of amusement in his voice. Lena blinked. You waited for me. I wanted to say thank you again, not just for Caleb, for how you handled him. You were kind. She tilted her head. You really didn't have to wait. I know, he said, but I wanted to. He stepped out of the car and Lena's breath caught again. He wasn't just rich, he carried himself like someone who owned everything he touched. But there was something else in his eyes, something softer. I'm Harrison, he said, offering his hand. I figured, she said, shaking it. You've got Caleb's eyebrows, he laughed. The sound was low, almost surprised, like he wasn't used to people teasing him. Would you let me take you to dinner? He asked. Lena stared at him. You want to take me to dinner? I'm not usually the type to ask someone out the same day I meet them, he said. But I also don't usually meet people who make my son laugh when he's terrified. She narrowed her eyes, trying to read him. You do realize I'm not impressed by cars and suits, right? I was hoping you wouldn't be, he said quietly. Something about his answer made her pulse quicken. I don't date patients' parents, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Then maybe I wait a week, he said, smiling. Or maybe I bring Caleb by for a follow-up and we casually bump into each other again. You're persistent. I'm interested. Lena hesitated. She'd been burned before guys who thought nurses were easy fixes, or who lost interest once they realized she worked double shifts and came home exhausted. But this felt different. "I'll think about it," she said. "Maybe I'll leave it up to fate." Fate apparently worked fast. 3 days later, Lena walked into the clinic's break room to find a white box with her name on it. Cautiously, she opened it and gasped. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, simple but elegant, with a tiny charm shaped like a stethoscope. A small note was tucked inside. "For the nurse who reminded my son he's braver than he thinks." Lena stared at it, heart-thudding. What kind of billionaire sends a charm bracelet instead of diamonds, the kind who saw her? And suddenly, dinner didn't seem like such a bad idea. The restaurant was perched on the top floor of a glass tower that Lena had passed dozens of times, but never thought she'd walk into, much less be led through by a man who handed his keys to the valet without looking back. The maitre d' greeted Harrison by name, and a private elevator took them straight to a rooftop terrace empty, except for a table set with glowing candles and a view of the entire city skyline. "This isn't dinner," Lena said as they stepped onto the terrace. "This is a scene from a movie." Harrison looked over at her, his hands in the pockets of his coat. "I didn't want anything loud. I thought we could talk." "Talk," she repeated, arching a brow. "In a place where the wine list probably has its own security team." "I didn't bring you here to impress you," he said. "I wanted you to see where I come when I need to think." His voice was calm, but Lena caught the undercurrent. This place wasn't about showing off. It was personal. They sat, and a waiter appeared only long enough to pour wine and disappear again. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was edged with curiosity, both of them unsure how much to reveal. "You're not what I expected," Harrison said, leaning back in his chair. "Let me guess," Lena replied. "You thought I'd be either starstruck or suspicious. I thought you'd say no to dinner." "I almost did." "Why didn't you?" She turned her head, watching the lights shimmer below them. "Because I kept thinking about how your son looked at you when you walked into that room, like he wanted you to fix it but didn't expect you to." Harrison didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Caleb's mother left when he was 8. I was still building the company, still pretending I could do everything at once. I missed a lot." Lena didn't interrupt. She just listened, the way she did when patients needed more than medicine. "I've spent years trying to be the kind of father who doesn't miss anything. It's harder than it looks. You're doing something right," she said. "He trusts you even when he's scared. I saw how you looked at him, like he mattered not just as a patient but as a person. That's rare." She shook her head. "It shouldn't be." Their food arrived, grilled sea bass for her, something with truffle foam and an unpronounceable name for him. She stared at her plate. "Let me guess," Harrison said. "You're wondering if you're allowed to ask for ketchup." "I'm wondering if I need a dictionary." He laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Not polite or reserved, but easy and genuine. "You know," Lena said slowly, "this is the first time in months I've sat down without a clipboard or a chart in my hand." "Then let's make it count." She studied him across the table. "Why me?" He didn't hesitate. "Because you're the only person I've met in a long time who doesn't care who I am." That doesn't sound like a compliment. It is. I don't want someone who needs me. I want someone who sees me. Lena felt something tighten in her chest. She'd been so careful not to get involved with anyone who made her feel too much, too fast. But Harrison didn't ask for space or sympathy. He asked to be seen. After dinner, they stood at the edge of the terrace, the wind teasing her hair. Harrison moved closer but didn't touch her. "Do you always work this much?" he asked. "Only on days ending in Y." "Why?" "Because I can't afford not to." He looked at her then, really looked. "You're not just doing this for the paycheck." "No," she said, her voice lower. "I'm doing it because someone once did it for me. When I was 17, my sister got sick. We didn't have insurance. There was one nurse who stayed after every shift to help us figure things out. That's why I became one." "Is she okay now?" She passed the week before I graduated. Harrison was silent. Then softly, "I'm sorry." "I'm not," Lena said. "Not for doing it, not for remembering her in this way." He reached out then, brushing her hand gently with his. She didn't pull away. "Come with me this weekend," he said quietly. "Where? Somewhere quiet, just you and me, no patients. No boardrooms. I usually don't travel with men I've just met. I'm not asking you to trust me yet. I'm asking you to give yourself space to breathe. She looked at him, torn. And if I say no, I'll wait. I don't think I've ever met anyone like you, she admitted. Maybe that's why I can't get you out of my head. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned into the railing, letting the moment stretch between them. That night, Harrison didn't kiss her. He opened her car door, thanked her for coming, and watched her drive away. It wasn't restraint. It was patience. The next morning, Lena walked into the clinic and found a sealed envelope waiting at the front desk. Inside was a plane ticket, first class, and a note that read only, "No pressure, just possibility." She stared at it for a long time before tucking it into her bag. Later that afternoon, she found herself standing in a supply closet, staring at shelves of bandages and trying to shut out the part of her heart that wanted to believe in fairy tales. "Earth to Lena," her coworker Maria said as she poked her head in. "You okay?" "You're holding gauze like it's an engagement ring." Lena laughed, startled. "I'm fine, just thinking." "Well, stop thinking and help me with the delivery. We're out of pediatric thermometers again." As she helped unload boxes, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "I hope you're having a good day. Caleb says hi." She hesitated, then typed back, "He should drink more water." Seconds later, "He says he's drinking juice. Apparently that counts." A grin tugged at her lips. That weekend, she stood at the gate, ticket in hand, heart pounding. She didn't know what was waiting on the other side of that flight, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. The weekend escape was not what Lena expected, and that was saying something. Considering she'd spent the past 2 days trying to convince herself she wasn't about to walk into a billionaire's private fantasy. There was no private island, no paparazzi, not even a bodyguard in sight. Instead, Harrison met her at the small airstrip outside the city, standing beside a vintage Cessna with rolled sleeves and a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The expensive suit, gone. The intimidating air, muted. He looked like someone who knew how to build a fire and fix a leaky roof, not a man who regularly closed deals worth hundreds of millions. "You're flying it?" Lena asked, eyeing the plane with suspicion. He grinned, but not in a way that felt rehearsed. "Don't worry. I've had my pilot's license since I was 21. I'm better at this than I am at small talk." She raised a brow. "That's not a high bar." His laugh was quick, almost surprised. "You're right. I'm terrible at small talk." The flight was short, just under an hour, and the view was breathtaking: rolling hills, winding rivers, and in the distance, the silhouette of a cabin nestled between tall evergreens. He didn't speak much while flying, focused on the controls, but every once in a while, Lena caught him glancing at her, like he was still trying to figure out how she'd ended up sitting beside him in the first place. When they landed on the private strip near the cabin, Lena stepped out and inhaled deep pine-scented air. The quiet wrapped around her like a warm blanket. No sirens, no beeping monitors, no fluorescent lights humming above her head. "You own this?" she asked, walking toward the cabin perched on a ridge. "My grandfather built it. He left it to me when he passed. I come here when I need to remember who I was before everything became noise." Inside, the place was simple. Wooden beams, stone fireplace, and furniture that looked lived in rather than staged. No marble floors or gold fixtures. Just a wall of books, a record player, and a large window overlooking a lake that shimmered like glass. "I didn't bring you here to impress you," Harrison said, setting down his bag. "I brought you here because this is the only place I can breathe without being someone I'm expected to be." Lena walked to the window, her arms crossed. "You don't owe me explanations. I know. But I want you to know that if you're going to spend time with me, I want it to be real, not curated." She turned, her expression unreadable. "Then don't curate it. Just exist." An hour later, they were sitting on the deck with mugs of strong coffee, the kind that left bitterness on the tongue and warmth in the chest. He told her about his grandfather teaching him how to chop wood, how to balance a fishing rod on the dock without scaring the trout. She asked questions, not to pry, but to understand. "Did you ever want to do something else?" she asked, blowing on her drink. "I studied architecture in college," he said. "Wanted to design buildings that didn't just look beautiful but felt like home." "So what happened?" "My father happened," he said, his voice flat. He told me legacy didn't come from blueprints, it came from empires. And you listened? I told myself I'd use the power to do good. That I'd build the life I wanted after I'd earned the right, but somehow I forgot to stop running. Lena leaned back in her chair, staring up at the sky. You know what I think? Dangerous words. She glanced at him. I think you're afraid that if you slow down, everything you built will vanish. He didn't answer, but the line of his jaw tightened. That evening, they cooked together. Not with a private chef or catered ingredients, but with what was stocked in the cabin: pasta, garlic, heavy cream, and a bottle of wine older than she was. He handed her a knife and a cutting board without ceremony. You're not going to tell me how to do this? She asked. I trust you not to poison me. She chopped while he stirred. Music played on the old record player, soft and scratchy, like memories caught on vinyl. At some point, she turned to say something and found him watching her with a strange intensity, like he was memorizing the way she moved. What? She asked, self-conscious. You're nothing like the women I've known. Is that supposed to be a compliment or a warning, a revelation? He didn't look away, and the air between them shifted. The timer on the oven beeped, breaking the moment. She turned quickly, pretending her heart hadn't just slammed against her ribs. After dinner, they sat by the fire. He poured more wine. She curled her legs beneath her. The conversation wandered from childhood stories to the worst pickup lines they'd ever heard to the books they'd never admit to loving. Do you ever get tired of being needed? He asked suddenly. She hesitated. Yes. But I also don't know who I'd be if I wasn't. I envy that. You envy being needed. No, I envy knowing your purpose. She watched the flames flicker against the stone. Purpose isn't something you find, it's something you choose, every day. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What would you choose if no one needed you? I'd still help people, she said, but maybe I'd paint again. That startled him. You paint. Used to. Haven't picked up a brush in years. Why not? Because I started measuring time in 12-hour shifts and missed meals. He stood then, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a dusty box. Inside were old supplies, canvases, brushes, tubes of oil paint, half used and faded. My grandfather used to paint the lake at sunset, he said. He said it changed every time. She stared at the box, her throat tight. I don't want to forget who I was, she said quietly. Then don't. He didn't touch her, didn't try to close the space between them. But his words clung to her more than any embrace could have. That night, Lena stood at the edge of the dock alone, toes curling over the wood, the wind brushing her hair back. She could hear Harrison moving inside, the creak of the floorboards, the clink of dishes. But out here, everything was still. She whispered her sister's name to the lake just once. Then she closed her eyes and let the sound be carried away. When she returned inside, Harrison was on the couch, a blanket over his lap, a book in hand. He looked up as she entered, not startled, just aware. You okay? He asked. I think I am. He nodded, like he understood more than she said. She hesitated, then sat beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. She didn't pull away. I don't want this to be temporary, he said, without looking at her. What is this? I don't know yet. But I know it matters. She rested her head against his shoulder, and for a while neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, something quiet and fragile began to grow between them, and for the first time in a long time, Lena didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was beginning. Rain swept across the tarmac as the plane touched down, the soft roar of water on metal signaling the end of the weekend that had somehow changed everything. Lena watched the runway lights blur through the window as Harrison guided the plane into the hangar. Neither had spoken much during the flight. Not out of discomfort, but the kind of silence that lingered when too many new things had taken root to name. Once on the ground, they walked together beneath the shelter of a narrow canopy to his car. Harrison opened the passenger door for her and she climbed in, the scent of cedar and leather still clinging faintly to her coat from the cabin. He slid behind the wheel and started the engine, but didn't shift into drive. I'll take you home, he said, his voice low. You don't have to, Lena replied. I know I want to. The drive back into the city was quiet, but not in the way it had been before. There was an ease between them now, a rhythm that didn't require filling. Buildings grew taller as they neared downtown, their reflections warping in rain-slicked streets. When he pulled up in front of her apartment, Lena hesitated before reaching for the handle. "Do you want to come up?" she asked. Harrison looked over, his expression unreadable. "Only if it's not out of obligation." She turned to face him fully. "It's not." Her apartment was small, with peeling paint near the windows and a couch that had seen better years, but it was clean, warm, real. She kicked off her shoes and tossed her keys into a chipped ceramic dish without apology. Harrison stood just inside the door, glancing at the bookshelf packed with paperbacks and medical journals stacked in uneven piles. "You live like someone who doesn't plan to be home much," he said. "I'm usually not." He stepped further in, his gaze sweeping the room once and then landing on the canvas leaning against the far wall. It was blank, except for a single streak of blue sweeping across it like a sky waiting to be named. "Is that the beginning or the end?" he asked. "It's the middle. I started it years ago and didn't know what came next." Harrison reached out, brushing his fingers lightly across the wooden edge of the frame, then turned to her. "Start again." Lena crossed the room, stopping just short of him. "You make it sound easy." "I don't think it is. I just think it's necessary." She studied him, this man who had walked into her life because of a scared boy with a stomachache and turned everything she thought she knew about herself into something softer, more open. He reached out and tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering a moment longer than needed. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on whether you're willing to let me be part of your world." She tilted her head. "What if I don't know how to do that? Then we figure it out together." The next week unfolded like something borrowed from a different life. Lena returned to work, but the weight she usually carried felt lighter. Not because her shifts were shorter, they weren't, but because her mind wasn't tangled in survival. She thought of Harrison in quiet moments. The way he listened without trying to fix, the steadiness of his presence, the way he'd looked at her across the firelight like she was the only true thing in the world. Every evening, there was something waiting. Sometimes it was a handwritten note slipped into the pocket of her coat at the nurse's station. Other times, it was a thermos of her favorite tea left at the front desk with her name written in his handwriting. Once it was a sketchbook with a single message tucked inside, "For the blue you haven't painted yet." She didn't tell anyone at the clinic, not because she was ashamed, but because it felt too sacred to throw into the noise of breakroom gossip and exhausted chatter. It was hers, theirs. One evening, after a particularly brutal shift involving a child with a rare autoimmune flare-up and a mother who hadn't slept in 2 nights, Lena came home to find Harrison waiting on her stoop. "You look like you've been through a war," he said, standing as she approached. "I've been through worse." He didn't try to make her laugh. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he opened the car door and said, "Come with me." She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. They drove for 15 minutes, winding through unfamiliar neighborhoods, until he pulled into the circular drive of a building she'd never seen before. It looked more like a gallery than a home, modern, expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows glowing from within. "I bought this place last year," he said, unlocking the front door. "I planned to sell it. It never felt like mine." She stepped inside, the scent of fresh paint and possibility filling the air. The walls were bare, the furniture was minimal, but the space had potential. "Why bring me here?" "Because I want to build something that does feel like mine, and that means starting with truth." He led her upstairs to a room with high ceilings and northern-facing windows. The walls were painted a soft, neutral gray. In the center was a long table covered in art supplies, brushes, stretched canvases, unopened tubes of paint. "I had it set up for you, if you ever want to paint again." Her throat caught. "You can't just give me a studio. I'm not giving you anything. I'm offering you space. For you, not for us." "Not for me, just for whatever you need." She turned to him, overwhelmed. "You don't know what you're asking for." "Yes, I do. I'm asking to be part of the life you don't show anyone else." Lena walked to the table, running her fingers over the edge, then she looked back at him. "Why me?" He didn't hesitate. "Because when I'm with you, I remember who I wanted to be before I forgot, and because I've never met anyone who made me want to stay still." She crossed the room slowly, stopping in front of him. "I don't know how to do this. I'll wait. However long it takes." She kissed him then. Not out of impulse, but clarity. It wasn't slow or tentative. It was the kind of kiss that marked the beginning of something unshakable weeks past. She didn't move into the new place not yet, but she painted there, sometimes alone. Sometimes with Harrison working quietly nearby, reading or sketching designs for a new building he'd decided to design himself. Not for profit, for legacy. Caleb visited often. He brought his sketch pad and sat on the floor near Lena while she painted, occasionally asking questions or showing her his drawings. They never talked about that day at the clinic again. They didn't need to. One evening, Harrison walked into the studio carrying a small velvet box. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He simply placed it on the table and said, "Only open it if you want forever." She didn't open it right away. She waited until the room was quiet, until her hands weren't stained with paint and her heart had stopped thrumming with nerves. Inside was a ring that didn't glitter so much as glow, simple, timeless. Like the man who'd given it to her, she said yes the next morning, no fanfare, no crowd, just the two of them, standing on the deck of the cabin where everything had begun. They were married in the fall, beneath the turning leaves and the open sky. Caleb stood beside them, grinning like he'd known all along how it would end. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. The storm was already waiting above Manhattan when Lena stepped out of the gallery. The sky churned a bruised gray, thunder muttering in the distance like an old secret threatening to surface. She had paint beneath her nails and a voicemail from a curator at the Met that she hadn't had time to listen to. Her mind buzzed with the electricity of unfinished canvases and the memory of Harrison's hand resting gently against her back that morning as he kissed her temple and whispered, "You're not just good, you're necessary." She pulled her coat tighter around her and started toward the corner, but a sleek black car pulled up before she could hail a cab. The window rolled down. "Get in," Harrison said, hair wind tossed, tie loosened, eyes lit with something unspoken. "I thought you had that investor dinner." "I did. I left." "You left $1 million deal to pick me up in the rain," he looked at her, rain streaking across the windshield. "I'd leave the world if it meant getting to tell you what I'm about to say while looking you in the eye." She got in. Neither of them spoke as he drove. They wound through the city, past the familiar turns that led to the studio, past the route to her apartment, past everything she recognized. She didn't ask where they were going. He stopped in front of the old courthouse, now repurposed into a historic venue with marble steps that glistened in the rain. A man in a navy coat stood beneath the awning, holding something wrapped in white linen. He handed it through the window. "What is that?" Lena asked. Harrison didn't answer. He parked, stepped out into the rain, and came around to her side. She opened the door and he held out the bundle. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a framed sketch done in pencil, rough and unfinished of her. Not the version he'd seen at the studio or beside the lake. This was her in motion, laughing, her hair caught in the wind, eyes half closed like she'd forgotten anyone was watching. "I never finished it," he said, "because I realized I didn't want to capture a moment. I wanted to live everyone with you instead." Lena touched the edge of the frame. The glass was warm from his hands. "You're not the only one who's scared of forgetting who they are," he added. "I spent years creating the perfect life on paper. But it felt empty until you stepped into it," her breath caught. "You don't need to say anything," he said quickly. "I know what I'm asking. I know this isn't simple." She stepped forward, her voice quiet. "You think I haven't imagined what it would be like to build something permanent with you? That I haven't stood in front of my easel trying to paint what it feels like to be seen for the first time," he stilled. "But I can't be part of your world if it means disappearing in it. Then we build one that belongs to both of us." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. But he didn't open it, not yet. "Lena Bradford," he said, rain falling between them, "you are the only thing that's ever made me believe in the idea of always. Not because it's easy, because it's real. I don't want to wake up another day without knowing you're next to me. Will you marry me?" She closed the distance between them and kissed him without hesitation, the kind of kiss that didn't ask questions, only gave answers. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes to you, yes to this. Yes to everything we haven't figured out yet." He opened the box and slid the ring onto her finger. It wasn't flashy, it was intentional. A singular diamond set in a band carved with a subtle wave, like the lake where it all began. They didn't go to dinner that night. They went home. She peeled off her soaked clothes while he made tea, and when she stepped into the living room in his shirt, he looked at her like she hung the stars. "What do we do now?" she asked, curling onto the couch beside him. "We start choosing each other," he said simply. The following weeks passed in a blur of quiet mornings and chaotic days. Caleb threw himself into designing wedding invitations on his iPad, insisting they include a sketch of the lake. Harrison met with architects to start building the art clinic Lena had dreamed of for years, a place for underserved children to explore healing through creativity. It was her vision, but his resources turned plans into blueprints, and blueprints into foundations. The ceremony was held in late spring, in the garden behind the studio, surrounded by friends who had become family. The aisle was lined with lanterns and wildflowers, the air thick with the scent of lilac and fresh paint. Lena wore a dress that moved like wind when she walked, her hair pinned back with delicate strokes of silver. Caleb stood beside Harrison, grinning in a tailored navy suit. When she reached him, Harrison didn't speak right away. He just looked at her like every promise he'd ever made to himself had just walked down the aisle. "You make me want to be more than I ever thought I could be," he said, when he finally found his voice. "Not because you need me to be, but because you already see me as that man." She reached up, brushing her fingers along the line of his jaw. "You were always that man. You just needed someone to remind you." They said their vows beneath a sky that held no storms, only stars. Later that night, after the laughter and dancing quieted, Harrison carried her into their bedroom, still in his dress shirt and undone tie. She traced the ring on her finger, then the edge of his collarbone. "Do you think it'll always be like this?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the hum of the city below. "No," he said, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "I think it'll be better." She smiled into the curve of his neck, and he wrapped his arms around her, anchoring her to the kind of truth people spend lifetimes chasing. Months passed. The clinic opened its doors. Nurses and artists worked side by side, and Lena's paintings filled the hallways not as decoration, but as declaration. Caleb started high school taller every week, his sketches sharper, more confident. Harrison shifted his company's focus towards sustainable architecture, taking fewer meetings and spending more time at the studio, sometimes just watching Lena paint in the golden light of sunset. They traveled when they wanted to, never for escape, only for expansion. Florence, Kyoto. A cabin in Iceland that reminded them of the one where it all began. They made decisions together, fought with respect, loved with clarity, built a world of their own design. One evening, Lena stood in her studio, a new canvas in front of her. Harrison walked in, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Another commission?" he asked. "No, this one's for us." He walked over and read the words she had penciled lightly at the bottom corner. "For the life still unfolding," she looked up at him. "Because we're just getting started." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "Forever," he whispered, and in the quiet that followed, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They'd already said everything that mattered.